Hey, what's going on, guys? Brian from Zombie Guitar here. This is part 8 of the chord tone soloing series. Alright, so in this part what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the non-triad tones now, okay? So, up until now throughout this series we've been focusing on targeting chord tones of the underlying chords within the progression. And when I say chord tones, I've been referring to the triads, the roots, the thirds, and the fifths, okay? The root, third, and fifth of a chord makes up the triad. Okay, so, there's still the rest of the scale to look at, okay? So just because you're targeting chord tones does not necessarily mean that you have to hit chord tones at all times, okay? You can hit other non-chord tones as the chord is occurring too. This will add, you know, certain color, certain tensions, certain expressions to your playing that otherwise wouldn't be available if you were to stick just to chord tones, okay? So we're going to be doing this example using the key of G major, which is the same key that we've been using throughout this progression. Okay, the chord progression is going to be a 4-1-5-6 progression, so it's going to be C to G to D to E minor. Okay, and as each chord is occurring, we're just going to be doing a tiny little bit of lead playing, but we're going to be focusing on one chord at a time and hearing how each of the scale tones sounds over each of the chord, okay? So you're going to be hearing both chord tones and both non-chord tones over each of the 4 chords. Okay, so let's get on to that. So we're going to do the same chord progression that we did in the first couple lessons, which were in the key of G major. It's a progression that goes like this. I'll just play it on my looper. Okay, so that's C to G to D to E minor. Okay, and then your C would be your 4 chord, your G would be your 1 chord, your D would be your 5 chord, and your E minor would be your 6 chord. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one position, and this same thing can be applied to any position obviously, but we're going to look at how each particular chord tone sounds in relation to the underlying chord as the chord is occurring. So, for the first chord, we're going to analyze the C, okay? So, the chord progression is C, G, D, E. So, as I do this, I'm going to loop that progression, and I'm going to start out with the C, and I'm going to play just the 1 tone over top of the C, okay? And then for all the other chords, I'm going to land on chord tones. So for the C, I'm going to be going through the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, the 6, and the 7. But for the G, the D, and the E, I'm going to be landing on chord tones. So we want to hear how each of the scale tones in relation to the C is going to sound. So let me just demonstrate that. So here's your 1 of your C. Okay, that's the root of your note C. Here's your C shape. Okay, so there's your root. Okay, here's your second. Here's your third. Here's your fourth. Here's your fifth. Okay, and then if we come down here, here's your sixth. Here's your seventh. Okay, and here's your root again. Okay, so I'm just kind of sticking to high strings here. Obviously you have roots, thirds, fifths, and all the other scale tones on the lower strings. But to really get to hear how these things sound, we're going to just stick to the higher 3 strings, okay? So I'm just going to go through each one of the C and then land on chord tones for the other 3 chords, okay? So let's hear how this sounds. Okay, so you see how I just kind of rotated through all of the possible scale tones over top of the C chord. So for the G, the D, and the E minor, I left, I hit chord tones of each one of those three chords, but for the C, I went root, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. And if you hear how each one of those sounds, the root sounded good, as it always is going to because it's part of the triad. The second sounded good, okay? The third sounded good because it's part of the triad. The fourth sounded very, very bad. It sounded very clashy. So although that was in the key of G major, so technically it was, and it was in the scale, that particular note sounded really bad. So if you are one that is just thinking in terms of scales, and you don't focus on chord tones, you may come across that note in your playing by accident just because you're doing your scalar runs with paying no mind to what the chord is. You may land on that one note and over top of the C chord in this example, and it's going to sound bad. Okay, so the 4 didn't sound good. The 5 sounded good. Okay, that's part of the triad. It always is going to sound good. The 6 sounded good. The 6 sounded very melodic. And then the 7th, it sounded very melodic as well. So really, all of the scale tones worked. The root, 3rd, and 5th were obviously the strongest. But the 2nd, 6th, and 7th had a nice melodic feel to it that otherwise wouldn't have been available if you were sticking primarily to chord tones, okay? This is just in this instance, okay? This is not applicable to all major chords and all progressions. Just this particular progression, what we found is there's some nice color tones that we can add in addition to the chord tones as we see fit, okay? Except for that 4th, so we noticed that 4th scale tone over top of the C just sounded like crap, okay? So let's try and do the same thing for the G chord now. Okay, so the G chord here is your 1 chord, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go through the root, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th over top of the G now, and for the other 3 chords, the C, the D, and the E, we're going to stick to just chord tones, okay, so we can really analyze how everything sounds over top of the G. Okay, so here's your 1 for the G, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then back to your root again. Okay, so starting out, we're going to first start on the 1 of the G, okay? Okay, so I did the same thing there, but for the G chord. And starting out with the 1, we heard that the 1 sounded nice, as it's always gone to, because it's part of the triad. The 2 didn't sound good. Okay, that's a matter of opinion, of course. Maybe you may want to use something like that as a particular tension. Okay, so you can use these bad sounding scale tones as you see fit. I just want you to understand how they sound in relation to a particular chord progression, in relation to the underlying chord. Okay, so in my opinion, the 2 does not sound like a chord that, or does not sound like a tone that I would want to land on as the G is occurring in this progression. But then the 3 sounded very nice, as it should, part of the triad. The 4 sounded better than the 2 in my opinion, but it still didn't sound all that great. Okay, so I probably wouldn't want to land on that tone if I was trying to play a nice melodic solo. Then you have your 5th, part of the triad, sounded good. The 6th, the 6th didn't sound great. had a little bit of melodic feel to it, but still it doesn't sound like a chord tone that I would want to land on. The seventh, okay, the seventh, that didn't sound good either. That sounded very, very tensiony, you know, did not want to land on that as a chord tone, okay? So really, for the one chord, I only really liked the root third and fifth, okay? Obviously, the root third and fifth are always going to sound good, but I wasn't really feeling any of the other chord tones. This is just my opinion, okay? So each of the other scale tones, I didn't mean to say chord tones, I meant to say each of the other scale tones that aren't triad tones in relation to the G, you may like that particular coloration, you may not. For me, for the one chord in this particular progression, just the root third and the fifth, okay? So let's do the same thing now, and we'll analyze the D chord in this progression. Alright, so the D chord here, right here is your D chord in your D shape. Alright, so let's start from here, from this note here, because this is the fifth scale degree. Here's your root. Okay, but I'm just, you know, trying to stick to the high three strings here and just play the high tones. Okay, so we'll start here, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that gives us all our scale degrees. It doesn't have to, it's not necessarily in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 order, but you still have all 7 scale degrees. So let's hear how each of these scale degrees sounds in relation to D, which in this particular progression is the 5 chord. Okay, so okay. So I did each one of those for the D chord now, and in my opinion, I kind of thought that every one of these scale tones sounded pretty good with this particular chord. Okay, I thought the least, like the one I liked the least was maybe the you know, that would be the 4. Okay, so if this is your 5, 5, and then 6, 7, and here's your root. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that would be your 4. I thought that might have been the least good sounding one, but I thought that still sounded good. That had a nice particular tension to it, where in this particular chord progression, that note right there, it just seemed to work. It wanted to move on to the next chord. Okay, so but all the other ones had a very melodic feel to it, so I would have definitely used them as you know, tones to land on in this particular chord, in this particular progression. Okay, so the 5 chord, I guess they all seem to work pretty well, with the exception of the 4, but again, that's a matter of opinion on whether or not you like that sound. Okay, just going by your ear, you know, all the tones sounded pretty good, except for the 4th sounded the least good. Okay, so let's take a look at the last chord, which is the 6th chord. Okay, the E minor chord. Okay, so now we're going to be taking a look at the E minor chord here, the 6th chord in this particular example. Okay, the 6th chord is always the relative minor chord of the major key. In this case, we're going to keep G major. E minor is your relative minor chord. Okay, and now I know I said we're only going to stick to the high 3 strings, but I'm going to make an exception for this particular chord because your 1 is right here, your root of this chord is here. Okay, and that's a common landing root when guitar players are playing. You always want to go to that root right there on the D string of the minor chord. Okay, so for this example, this is going to be our 1 that we start on, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, then back to 1, 2. Okay, so we'll hear how each of these sound in regards to this 6th chord, okay? So same thing, C, D, and G are just going to be chord tones now, and E minor is going to be where we are doing our testing. So. Okay, so I kept going once I got to the 1 because, you know, there was those 2 additional notes up there. I just wanted you to hear how, you know, the 2 and the 3 sounded, you know, in the higher octave there. But point being is, for the minor chord, in my particular opinion, of course, I always liked minor keys. I always liked kind of sadder, darker sounding music. I always liked metal and stuff like that. So when you're on a minor chord, in my opinion, anything kind of goes, okay? So those minor tensions, or those minor non-triad tones, I guess you could, some are more tensiony than others, if that's a word, okay? You know, for a minor chord, all those are color tones in my opinion. All those color tones work. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Obviously the 1, 3, and 5 are always going to work. Those are your triad tones, always going to be the most melodic. But you know, the 4, landing on the 4 in particular, which doesn't usually sound good over a lot of major chords, but in this particular example, the 4 had a very strong pull that wanted to bring you back to the 3, okay? So, you know, that 4 just has an extra darkness to it that I really like, okay? So, but this is just a matter of opinion, of course, and I just wanted you to hear how each of the other non-triad tones sound in relation to the underlying chord for each of these chords. So that's that. That is non-triad tones in the context of chord tone soloing. Alright, so as always, if I was confusing, if I left anything out, feel free to message me and I'll get back to you. Alright, thanks a lot.